afraid of the dark? Are you scared?
Hello and welcome to the Surrey Supernatural YouTube channel. My name is Graham and I run the Surrey Supernatural Investigations Facebook group. Today is the story of a couple's strange walk in the country. If Mrs. Benson had told her husband before that she didn't really feel up to walking in the Surrey countryside, then perhaps the strange occurrence that happened to her on that particular July Sunday in 1954 would not have happened to them but to another unexpected couple. The Bensons, which was the name given to them by the Society of Physical Research when they investigated and wrote up the case of this strange happening. The Bensons were antique dealers from Battersea and were quite exhausted by their work. On this particular Sunday, they decided they would get away from it all, but when Mrs. Benson woke up that morning, she felt depressed and felt like she would rather spend the day at home just having a lazy day. But rather than disappoint her husband, she decided that she would go for a walk in the country as she knew he'd be looking forward to it. The truth was that Mr. Benson also felt like a lazy day, but rather than spoil their plans, they went ahead with their walk in the country. They headed for Dorking in Surrey, England, from which they took a bus to Guildford, which would pass a stop called the Rookery when they intended to get off. However, they somehow missed their stop and ended up exiting the bus at a place called Wootton Hatch. They weren't too annoyed at the error as they knew the area well and it gave them a chance to visit the local church, St John the Evangelist. Also, this was where the grave of the famous John Evelyn was situated. The Bensons went into the church for a while and then came out and walked around the graveyard looking for the grave of John Evelyn. Once they had found it, they decided to go for a walk, which was the main reason they had come to the area. They walked out of the graveyard and turned uphill. The path was steep and ran between hedgerows. They seemed to have walked for ages when they reached a grass clearing with a bench. Tired from walking up the steep path, they decided they would take a break and rest. They sat there and took out the sandwiches which they had made. Mrs. Benson didn't have much of an appetite as she was feeling tired, and she had a feeling of unease that she was unable to put her finger on. Somewhere in the distance she could hear a dog barking, and all around her the birds were singing. Mrs. Benson sat looking across the grass stretched out in front of them. All of a sudden everything went completely quiet. Not a bird was singing, and there was no more barking dog. Mrs. Benson all of a sudden felt really cold, and she turned to her husband and asked him if it had all of a sudden got cold. Mr. Benson leant across and felt her arms, and he recalls that her arms felt really cold, just like that of a corpse. Mrs. Benson said later that when this happened, she suddenly felt aware of three black figures standing in front of them. She said that they looked as if they were dressed in some kind of clerical robes, but she was unable to see their faces. Mrs. Benson recalls that the middle man of the three seemed quite friendly, but the two either side seemed filled with hatred. All of a sudden the figures moved behind them, and this made Mrs. Benson feel uneasy, as they were now out of her eye line. She tried to turn her head to see them, but she was unable to, as for some reason she was unable to move. All of a sudden the apparitions had disappeared, and once again Mrs. Benson was able to move. Mr. Benson had not been aware of the three apparitions, but was aware that his wife had gone some strange experience. Mr. Benson knew that he had to leave the area for the safety of his wife. They hurried back down the hill and across the railway line, when they were both overcome with fatigue and laid down to take a nap. In the early evening they awoke and were surprised to find themselves back in Dorking. Not knowing how they had returned back to where they had started from, they had no memory at all of getting back there. Had they walked, caught a bus, or had a lift? They did know they couldn't even remember laying down to take a nap. It had been such a strange day and was so unpleasant that they did not return to that part of Surrey for some time. It was June Benson that returned after a curiosity got the better of her in 1956. She returned to make sense of what had happened to them. When she returned to the church, it was just how she remembered, but when she turned right after the churchyard, like her and her husband had done on that day, June could not find a path that rose steeply and was overgrown that they both walked up on that day. In fact, the land that laid about the church was quite flat. June went back to the church thinking she had gone wrong and took another way up the church. There were some people walking around, and June decided to speak to them. These were people who were local to the area and knew the paths about quite well, but none of them knew of the path up the hill and the bench on top of the hill at all. The following Sunday, George decided to return to solve the mystery, and he spoke to one of the congregation from the church. The gentleman he spoke to was in fact a woodcutter from the nearby Woodton estate. George told him about the path, the hill, and the bench at the top, but the woodcutter said there was no such path in the area. After these two visits, George and June were completely mystified about their experience to that day. A few weeks later, George and June contacted the Society of Physical Research, but at this time the society was moving and the Benson's case file was mislaid for 20 years, and it was not until 1973 that two members decided to investigate the case. They were in no doubt that the Bensons were telling the truth and that the Bensons had in fact suffered some kind of strange experience, but June had suffered more by seeing the three strange apparitions. The fact that the Bensons had both imagined the climb was not impossible, as such psychic experiences had been recorded, or were they really in this mysterious place in a physical sense, and then somehow returned the door key without knowing it. Was this a trick of space, or was there some other reality apart from the one in which we live? Was it possible that in fact the Bensons somehow had stepped into a parallel world? Although this was absurd, for hundreds of years scientists had pondered over the ideas of a parallel universe. In researching the case, the two members turned to the diary of John Evelyn for an answer to the three apparitions. They found several entries regarding a group of men that were standing trial for conspiracy to murder the king. The three men that stood trial were Edward King, Thomas Keyes, and Robert Sharlock, who was a priest and vice president of Magdalen College at Oxford. All three men were hung, drawn and quartered at Tyburn. For people that don't know, Tyburn was an estate in London, England, and became well known for its gallows, where the criminals of the time were brought and hung for their crimes. These fences often drew large crowds to watch the criminals taking their last breath. The very last hangings in this site was on the 3rd of April 1783, when a highwayman called John Austin was hung. Was it possible that the three men that the Benson saw was in fact the spirits of these three men, the round-faced one being Robert Sharlock? Was it the fact that the Bensons visited the grave of John Evelyn coincided with the arrival of these three men in its phantom landscape? Or was it that the Bensons were feeling a bit under the weather and were strangely receptive to some psychic abilities within the confines of the church? Also, was it possible that June Benson had somehow tuned into the personality of John Evelyn and his diary entries, and somehow his thoughts about this particular area had been transferred into the mind of the Bensons when they visited the church? This would go against all logic and the superimposition of the three men that in fact had nothing to do with this area of Surrey whatsoever, and had nothing to do with John Evelyn at all. What a remarkable day for the Bensons. Not only was it possible they may have slipped into another dimension, but also could have experienced a time slip. It is known that some people that experience these have some kind of premonitions, have a sense of foreboding and discomfort. They also remark at a loss of time and a sudden blanketing of sound. Paralysis is also a common symptom, and they often can't recall the events of that day. Was it possible that this was what happened to the Bensons? Thank you for listening. What do you think happened to the Bensons? Why not comment below? Please don't forget to subscribe and share. Bye, pal and the peeps. Stay safe and see you soon.